here in Detroit, and we are thrilled and delighted to have Jennifer Davis's plenary coming up. But before we turn over to that, I just want to have one more opportunity to thank the folks who made the conference possible. People who supported the conference deserve to be thanked more than once. So first of all, Andrew, wonderful partner in organizing, so easy to work with. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, well. And then we have people who gave us money, which is not as valuable, but needs to be thanked as well. Wayne State University had several units that provided funds: the Department of History, Department of Anthropology, Department of Classical and Modern Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, the Program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, the Humanities Center, the Office of the Vice President of Research, and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. We were fortunate enough that our neighbors in Windsor, at the University of Windsor, their history department provided funds as well. Loyola University, Maryland provided funds from the Dean's Office in the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Office of Academic Affairs. Oakland University's Department of History provided funds, and then Duke University Press came through for us again and sponsored last night's wine reception. So we thank those people very sincerely for helping make this conference possible.
So before I introduce our plenary speaker, I want to make sure I recognize Janine for all of the hard work she did organizing the conference. It was an amazing opportunity to work with you. So I'm thrilled to introduce our plenary speaker, Jennifer J. Davis. I will read her biography in a moment, but I do want to just say on a personal note, I've been on both sides of the kind of editorial process with Jennifer, and as a junior scholar, like reading your work for an edited volume just completed, how amazing it was to craft an amazing essay, and then I had an article in the Journal of Women's History that is kind of on its way, and you helped me, work through some reader reports, and I really just appreciated that. And you've been an amazing person to work with over the past couple of years. So we're so excited you're here to give this talk. So Jennifer J. Davis is a historian of early modern France and its Atlantic Empire at the University of Oklahoma, and serves as co-editor of the Journal of Women's History, a quarterly peer-reviewed scholarly journal that showcases cutting-edge scholarship that centers women across all time periods and all locales. In 2013, she published Defining Culinary Authority: The Transformation of French Cooking, 1650 to 1830, with LSU Press, which provides a social history of French cooks. Her forthcoming book, Bad Subjects: Libertine Lives in the French Atlantic, 1619 to 1804, with the University of Nebraska Press, forthcoming this year, which I assume this talk comes, investigates how the, quote, libertine category functioned in law and literature across early modern France and the French Atlantic Empire. So I'll turn things over to you.
Right. Thank you all. Let me just adjust this. All right, how does that sound? You hear me? Okay. I'll just set my timer, because I am one of those professors. And get my glasses, because I am of that certain age. All right, so I cannot thank Janine and Andrew enough for the invitation to speak to you today. It is a genuine thrill, right? Like, I have that sense in the pit of my stomach of like the top of the roller coaster going down. It's just such an amazing opportunity to be invited to address this union of the two scholarly societies that really have incubated my career and that have given me so much food for thought over the years. So I hope in this talk to do some small payment toward that great debt that I owe all of you. I'm so grateful for the chance to speak particularly to this conference's broad themes of boundaries and encounters in French historical studies. It's kind of hard to imagine a better set of organizing principles for this particular meeting that unites, should we say unites? Maybe let's say brings together the Society for French Historical Studies with the Western Society for French History. In Detroit, of all places, a city that takes its name from the French term for the narrow straits of the nearby river, which we were given the opportunity to look at if we so chose, right? Of course, before anyone called this area Detroit, or Detroit, as everyone in Le Gaulle insists on saying it, it bore other names, right? This is an image from the 1744 map of North America, the North American continent. And it's one of the very few maps that we have that identifies its indigenous collaborator by name. So we know that there are indigenous collaborators on all of these maps that are created over the 16th and 17th centuries. This one identifies him by name. Joseph Lafrance was an Ojibwe French trader who collaborated with Arthur Dobbs in England to create this map of the Great Lakes and the networks of rivers that connected the continent's interior. So what I love about this image is first it locates us here in this place, right? But it also, it really showcases the extent to which water, right, and navigation by water is the essential feature to map, right, along with who are the people who control that particular water, right, and that's made really clear with this image. The area was called Yondotega, the Great Village in Algonquin, the language of the Sauk and Fox people who identify this place as their homeland. The Huron-Wendat called it Carontaine, coast of the Straits. And in 2019, the Indigenous Peoples Alliance succeeded in passing a measure in the City Council to rename the city with its Anishinaabe name, Wawiyatanong, where the water goes around. And it is called this every year on Indigenous Peoples Day. So let me just get to a close-up of these maps. Right? So real briefly, we see here Fort St. Joseph is identified along Lake St. Clair. Fort St. Joseph is actually on the other side of the Michigan Peninsula on the Illinois Lake, right? Which is identified here as Illinois Lake, Lake Michigan. And Detroit would be situated just here, right? On that strait connecting Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie, my lake, the lake on which I was born. This land is recognized as the ancestral hunting grounds by the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, the Anishinaabe nations who formed the Council of Three Fires. They gathered here and further north at Michilimackinac Island to settle disputes and respond to shared concerns. And it remains native land, as it was even as the French and the British established forts here at the Straits and further north at Mackinac Island. These forts were trading centers, military posts. They were magnets in a series of wars born of colonial rivalry that drew the people and the resources of this land into Europeans' global conflict. Wresting independence from those empires, European-descended settlers made westward expansion a central priority of the new federal government. And the Treaty of Detroit, negotiated in 1807, proclaimed in 1808, brought the leaders of the Ottawa, Ojibwe, Wyandot, and Potawatomi nations together with William Hull, who was then governor of Michigan Territory. And at that treaty, in exchange for 8 million acres of land, which created Detroit as a part of the U.S. government, members of those indigenous nations were to share in $10,000. made in annual payments of cash and goods, so that works out to about 1.2 cents per acre. And these were to be annual payments made in perpetuity. Their descendants retained hunting and fishing rights in the ceded lands and reserved property rights in their villages. Settlers and developers, of course, violated both of these provisions, and the annual payments ended within a generation. Today, over 30,000 Native Americans make this land their home, despite 2 centuries of federal and state policies aimed at dispossession and cultural erasure. And here this really connects with my own personal story, right? Because of these policies, many of the indigenous communities long established in this region now reside in my home state of Oklahoma. They are part of the over 500,000 indigenous people there, according to the 2020 census. The Native nations are the state's #1 employers. They promote initiatives in healthcare, in education, and cultural preservation that benefit everyone in the state. Most nations, including the Sac and Fox Nation, originally from this area, most sponsor college scholarships to enrolled citizens, and so I see these students every semester in my class. Native language, digital or immersion programs are expanding rapidly, and I would really encourage you, if you're interested, to check these out. The Cherokee Nation has a digital language immersion program. Many of the Native nations in Oklahoma do. Leaders of the Chickasaw Nation in 2021 offered to vaccinate all educators, and I am one of those educators. This is a recent history, is my point here, right? It is an ongoing history. It is a history that transcends state boundaries and national boundaries. And we, as a field, are particularly well positioned to highlight those connections, to draw those long stories, those long connections out. In North America, as in the Caribbean, South America, Africa, and Asia, we do important work when we trace the weight of France's global ambitions across the centuries, either in place names, in material culture, or in language. Where's the residue of that empire? I examine a slice of that global history in my forthcoming book, Bad Subjects: Libertine Lives in the French Atlantic, 1619 to 1814. And in the remainder of my time, I want to briefly outline what was a libertine, what happened to libertines, and what does it matter to us today? Because I know most of you are not 18th century historians and you don't, libertines, I don't care, right? But I think you should, and I hope to convince you by the end of this. Okay. The term libertine conjures a vanished world of the 18th century European aristocracy. I know this. We all know this. Whether we imagined the diamond-draped, heaving bosoms of dangerous liaisons, apply the name of Casanova to a sexual adventurer, or invoke the Marquis de Sade to mix together one person's torturous pain with another person's sexual pleasure, it is visions of vanished decadence that dominate our understanding of the term today. If you read the title, is that what you thought you were coming to? Right? Libertines were sex-crazed. They were pornographers. They were deviant. And in a world of strict social hierarchy, it was only members of the nobility who could indulge in such perverse fantasies without fear of punishment from church or royal authorities. However, something pathetic lurks in the figure as well, and the literary scholar Thomas Wynne explains that is because elite Frenchmen had been, and I'm quoting, reduced by royal absolutism to a parody of the warrior. The aristocratic libertine achieves renown through the conquest of women, end quote. So sexual adventures compensated for aristocrats eroding political and social power under absolutism. And the challenge of seduction, the thrill of physical pleasure, motivated the avowed libertine, who required no higher purpose from life than self-satisfaction. The The Libertine's excesses also made a profound impact on the surrounding society, one that hasn't always been construed as a negative force. Scholars, including Lynn Hunt and Stefan van Dam, have documented the political and cultural significance of Libertine literature, connecting the ethos communicated in those works to core ideals, including the rise of individualism, the separation of church and state, those ideals that shaped the contours of democratic politics and modern republicanism. In 18th century France, the Libertine novel represented both a symptom of and a potential cure for the disease of royal absolutism. And those characters who dared to claim freedom to engage in sexual behavior beyond the narrow confines of monogamous relationships purportedly paved the way for contemporary civil rights for all. Does that sound familiar as an argument about Libertine literature? My book demonstrates the portrait above represents a partisan caricature that has obscured the contours of the libertine as a category that functioned in early modern legal, literary, and social registers. So I'm saying we make a mistake if we think the libertine concerns only sex, or if we presume it only describes social elites or only men. And importantly, we lose the force the term marshaled centuries ago and neglect how its meanings change over time. Because the libertine life was not merely a subject for fiction. It was not only a topos against which to play out future revolutions. It was an available concept deployed around the Francophone world to navigate a pluralistic legal system. The term identifies a category proximate to crime, infused with profound social weight that I think it was helpful for me to kind of think of modern day quasi-crimes. So we use the term thug, right? Deadbeat. And these are, it's not a crime to be a deadbeat dad, right? But there is a shame, a kind of moral opprobrium that goes with the term that I think is really an analogy for the term libertine and how it worked in the 18th century. Libertine was a quasi-criminal accusation that took shape over centuries and across oceans. It was a shorthand that signaled an individual had as yet broken no laws, but they engaged in behavior that threatened families, communities, and the realm. And in French, of course, the term is gendered. It's libertin, the masculine, libertine, and the feminine. These gendered forms connoted different shades of scarcely tolerated wrongdoing, and they did not always reference sexual conduct. Parents often decried their libertin sons who left the family home without permission, secretly married against their parents' wishes, or gambled. When used against daughters, libertine almost always condemned an individual's sexual conduct. But an important element complicated the feminine form because a young woman need not have engaged in specific behavior to be tagged as a libertine. Slanderous talk sufficed. Because it wasn't a criminal charge, it proved nearly impossible for the accused to contest, relying on the French crown's power of arbitrary detention, which was strengthened by a set of laws passed in 1684 and 1700. State and parental authorities agreed when an individual subverted social hierarchy, he or she could be detained on the charge of engaging in libertine behavior. But time and again, those detainees, the accused, acknowledged while they may have engaged in actions that could qualify as unsocial or immoral, they would admit, I am a bad subject, terrible. But did I break the law? No, there's no crime here, no crime, no foul, right? This is a conversation that is all throughout the police records and then the court cases that I've seen. Not court cases, petitions to the government, right? If no crime had been committed, no lasting damage had been done to the social order. I was really interested with this book to trace how the libertine category was deployed around the French Atlantic. And I found that it served to bridge one of our key words here today, to bridge shifting jurisdictions between the church and the crown, between metropolitan and colonial judicial systems, because over 3 centuries, France forged an early modern overseas empire that was rooted in the fiction of a common faith, common law, and common language. Legal personnel and institutions proved central to that project. Laurie Wood, the historian of colonial law, Laurie Wood reminds us that the colonial Conseil Supérieur, quote, formed a global network of legal entrepôts, sites for legal services that allowed subjects around the world to access French law and judicial processes, end quote. It was in this space between royal directives, colonial judges' proposals, church authorities' practices, and imperial subjects' petitions that the early modern empire took shape. So following the insights of a generation of historians, I consider law to be a negotiated set of social and political practices rather than a static list of prohibitions and punishments. Over decades, in extensive correspondence and ministerial directives, royal, church, and colonial officials all agreed that a libertine was a bad subject. But they disagreed about everything else, right? Okay. So I want to bring up this dictionary definition because it at least shows that there was some attempt to give coherence to this concept, right? What actions made someone a bad subject? In 17th century Europe, a libertine reliably signified an individual who questioned or mocked orthodox religious teachings. Families in France understood libertine to include everything from gambling or marrying without parental permission to irreverent speech outside of a church. In Quebec of the 1680s, colonial officials used it to refer to Indigenous Americans who refused to adopt Christianity. But they also used it to refer to French traders engaged in commerce with Indigenous Americans beyond the reach of the state. The coureurs de bois were libertines par excellence, not because of sexual behavior, but because they were subverting the authority of the colonial state through their trade practices, which neglected to pay necessary taxes, for example. In this dictionary entry from 1694, the term signifies someone qui prend trop de liberté et ne se rend pas assidu à son devoir. Not properly assiduous to your duties. In colonial Louisiana, I see the term take a radical turn because there, administrators reserved the term to refer to French men who engaged in intimate relations across emergent racial lines. In 1727, on the Caribbean island of Martinique, 53 enslavers even used the term to refer to enslaved people who dared to observe the Christmas holy days with rest and recreation. That enslaved people could be seen as too free is an indication of the kind of capaciousness of this term. The Dictionary of the Académie Française of 1762 identified this adjective as describing anyone, quote, who loved their liberty and independence too much. I think that's all of us. Don't know. Denis Diderot relied on the term to communicate straightforward filial disobedience. And he identified the central figure in this painting by Jean-Baptiste Greuze as a young libertin in his essays on the Salon of 1765. So what's going on with this image? This young man has decided to join the army against his father's wishes. Right? So here again we can see the problem of family hierarchy and subverting family authority is the problem that's most signified by libertine. And I love this character of the recruitment officer off to the side. He's like, yeah, subvert that family authority, son. You're going to have a great time in the army. All right. In contemporary imaginations, the French Atlantic Empire emerged as the ideal destination for France's libertines, if only these individuals could be trusted to advance the kingdom's goals. So, in casting the French Atlantic as the frame for this inquiry, I rely on decades of scholarship, emphasizing the economic, personal, and legal ties that bound together the peoples in France, West Africa, North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Overwhelming evidence shows us legal personnel and practices bound these communities across the Atlantic Ocean, transforming laws and legal ideals. Libertines reveal the challenges in that process of forging a coherent royal and imperial legal system. So what happened to the libertines? For that, read the book, coming in July 2023. There are so many trajectories to trace, but I want to share a particularly important one with you today. In 1763, the French crown issued a royal decree that determined to send young people of bad behavior to Désirade, an enticingly named palm-covered spit of an island some 20 kilometers square, due east of Guadeloupe. All right, so you see Guadeloupe is the kind of beautiful butterfly island in the center here, and Désirade is off to the right. Yes, off to the right. The text of this law expressly charted a path from shame to redemption, from exile to contributing colonist. Forced emigration was to be a key element of the reformed French Empire for like 5 years. Well, more about that later. The goal was to better employ all the human resources of the metropole for settlement. So with the libertines, these few bad apples might profit from the isolation of their island exile. There they could engage in meaningful work, learn the value of labor, and return to France having improved the empire and themselves. The law's advocates seem to have imagined that a handful of elite families would have the financial means to take advantage of this opportunity, distance their progeny from the corrupting influences of Paris and Versailles, and hopefully reap the rewards of an improved son, or yeah, it was only sons. Within just a few months, though, parents rich and poor from across the kingdom demanded that this punishment be applied to their own offspring. And so it was that hundreds of young men of every social station from every region of France converged in the port of Rochefort, where it soon became apparent that the Navy lacked the food, the housing, and the transatlantic transport capacity to provide for this population. Nearly a year into the experiment, the Intendant of Caen wrote to the Royal Minister of the Marine, "There is, sir, such considerable demand regarding bad subjects requested by families for the island of Désirade that it is impossible for the king to provide all necessary funds for either their detention in the port of Rochefort or their transport to that island and food to sustain them," end quote. Where to start? Okay. Officials worried about keeping detainees fed, healthy, and safe in Rochefort, let alone getting them across the ocean. They worried about the detainees, but they also fretted that parents might abandon payment after receiving confirmation that their troublesome kin was safe and secure far away. The naval officer at Rochefort first received official word of the new decree that would transform his job on August 3rd, 1763. The Duc de Choiseul explained the king had decided to allow the transport of bad subjects who are all too common in families, end quote. And they would go to Désirade at private expense. However, those exiles would need to be moved through France to Rochefort, housed in the prisons there, and surveilled throughout their detention and transport. Good luck with that. Bye! The Duke reported, His Majesty wishes 4 reliable men from the sergeants and the corporals of the colonial troops that are stationed in Rochefort to inspect the bad subjects in Désirade, end quote. He proposed wages of 300 to 400 livres per year, plus 2 rations a day for the officers. As Governor General of the island, Choiseul appointed the decorated Canadian naval officer Gabriel Rousseau de Villejoin, who was to receive 3,000 livres for this office. In addition, Villejoin's sons would join him as military supervisors of the Libertine exiles. The appointments for the Governor General, his sons, attending officers mean it cost about 9,000 livres just to pay the people, just the jailers, right? Just to pay them. Plus, there would be a substantial and continuing expense for the French crown in terms of creating the lodgings for these people, right? This meant that the colony required 25 detainees paying 200 livres per year just to cover the salaries. The colonial administrators argued the expense was worth it if exile improved the behavior of the bad subjects and encouraged broader settlement of the Caribbean. So within the first few months of this experiment in island exile, Villejoin sent reports back to his supervisors in France. He could observe that his prisoners, for the most part, behaved themselves well. In his reports, he identified a first class, right, consisting of 22 prisoners, and recommended that they be accorded immediate liberty, right? They are fine. They're no problem. I don't even know why they're here, he's saying obliquely, right? Of Antoine Philippe du Equet, the governor noted, he has, quote, always behaved well. His only fault is drink, and that occurs only rarely, end quote. This man is a military officer. He knows bad behavior, right? And he's saying, these guys, these 22, they're fine. A second class included 16 prisoners who had committed light offenses but merited liberty nonetheless, from Villejoin's perspective. For instance, of Jean-Félix Péan, who was, quote, filthy and libertine, end quote, Villejoin remarked, for all that, he's not among the worst of his class. These men had broken no laws, they had harmed no one, they suffered greatly in this under-supported island exile, he argued. As for the third class, the governor identified his 7 worst offenders. These were liars, thieves, and deserters. For example, of Noël d'Argouges, he noted, the young man, quote, unites all the faults and nearly all the vices, is dangerous, made several attempts to escape, gives bad counsel, spent 3/4 of his time in prison and in irons, end quote. But then that raised the question for Villejoin, what was this man doing in island exile, threatening the existence of his fellow detainees and the officers charged with supervising him? The governor obliquely expresses frustration with both the state and the families that would consign to island exile so many healthy young men due to youthful indiscretions or generational disputes. In Villejoin's estimation, only 7 of his 45 prisoners really merited detention, and they would have been better off imprisoned in fortified centers rather than in the eminently escapable Désirade. One exile in particular, Jean-Baptiste Alliot, won Villejoin's confidence. In August 1765, the young man penned a letter professing deep remorse for his past wrongs, testifying to the extreme privations of his living conditions on the island. The head of the Colonial Bureau, Jean Dubuc, prevailed upon Alliot's family to provide a more generous pension for him, observing it had been over a year since they had received any money or any news from him, from the family. Alliot suffered a terrible infection in his leg that had no chance of improvement without necessary remedies. And this climate, which is completely contrary to medical recovery. Villejoin himself had loaned this young man money on several occasions, and Alliot bemoaned the fact that, quote, "For 9 months, Monsieur Villejoin has written to my father in my favor to ask him to send the money which he should have sent. I see with pain my father has not even responded to him," end quote. The prisoner concluded by asking for administrative favor in the absence of paternal recognition. And I quote, "Am I not punished enough, separated from my wife and son, without being sent 2,000 leagues from my homeland, more miserable than the blacks who inhabit this country," end quote. In Alliot's appeal, he equates his own captivity with that experienced by enslaved Africans in the Antilles. Transported in a passenger ship, provided with lodgings and regular food and access to paper, ink, and political influence, he bore no resemblance to enslaved laborers, to the men and women who were forced to labor for other people's enrichment and faced daily terrors from the enslavers. But he was not the only one to draw such faulty comparisons. In equating monarchical, patriarchal, and enslavers' authority over social subordinates, revolutionary discourse across the Atlantic would galvanize people of all social stations to challenge monarchy, patriarchy, and the law of slavery throughout the French colonies by 1793. Throwing himself at the mercy of the French administrators to judge his crimes and punishment, Alliot became a case example for both Dubuque and Villejoin of the abuses of this settlement policy. As diplomatically as they could, both men opposed open-ended exile of young men in a tropical island detention center. And by the end of 1765, the governor of Guadeloupe argued persuasively the Desirade colony was too expensive to maintain, and he requested permission to transfer these bad subjects to Guadeloupe, where they would be imprisoned, just in case they decided they should flee to nearby British colonies or join the maroon communities of runaway slaves on the island. The penal colony on Desirade was not completely closed until 1767. That's when the final 30 remaining prisoners were transported to Guadeloupe. The lessons learned from the Desirade experiment left their mark on the French Empire. In 1781, Monsieur Veuve published a historical economic inquiry into France's American colonies, and he particularly reflected on this policy of deporting libertines. Veuve noted that many serious people thought and still think that punishing those for whom family or state politics requires prison, it would be best to send them to the colonies. In this way, they are not wholly lost to society, end quote. But the policy was ill-considered, concluded the author. The result had been to relegate all vices and bad conduct 2,000 leagues from the metropole, end quote. Moreover, both families and royal authorities too often overreacted to youthful indiscretions that would be resolved in time with maturity. The journalist observed that there were those among the exiles who could take the opportunity to transform themselves, and that a, quote, young man who had no other fault than laziness, which is what sensory libertinage is called, could correct himself with emigration. This young man, isolated in a distant country, filled with active and laborious people, could, by good example and the need to survive, acquire a taste for work and virtue. There exist notable proofs of this, but it's not common, is what he concludes, right? Yes, it could happen, but usually all of those pieces are not in place. The example posed by European libertines posed a particular threat, in fact, in colonies organized around racial hierarchy. In this theory, Veuve repeats one of the central assumptions advanced by colonial administrators from Quebec to Kourou. Quote, I am convinced the bad conduct of the whites is the principal cause of the corruption of blacks, by the impression it makes on them. It can't be too feared nor too much avoided, particularly in a new colony. It is therefore essential that only subjects of upright conduct and non-suspect morals be sent to the colonies, end quote. In the racial hierarchy that French officials sought to stabilize across the Caribbean in the 1780s, libertine, so-called, white men and women undermined colonial administrators' claim to moral authority. For all these reasons, the policy of transporting liberties, although it may have fulfilled the objectives of parents across France, proved irreconcilable to the king's authority and to the durable extension of colonial communities. Of course, that would not stop future governments from establishing penal colonies in French Guiana at the end of the 18th century and in New Caledonia in the 19th. So, by way of conclusion, I'd like to invite you to consider how a libertine methodology might intersect with your own research, teaching, and activism. So what do I mean by a libertine methodology? This will not require prophylactics. As I developed it, should have waited for that one. As I developed it, a libertine methodology seeks to reframe this keyword in a manner to register how contemporaries deployed it, and I had to consistently ask myself 3 questions. Well, I asked this of my sources, right? First, what do authorities identify as an important or contentious liberty in a particular time or place? Right? So if that's gambling, if that's sexual conduct, if that's religious dissent, right? This changes dramatically, and some of those coexist throughout this, this time period. So what's the most important liberty that we're looking at? Second, who claimed that liberty? Right? And then finally, at whose expense was a liberty claimed? Right? What damage does do the authorities assert is done by that liberty? Answering these questions helped me chart a legal system straining to contain an early modern French empire. But a libertine methodology also showcases individuals' agency and motivations as they negotiated overlapping and conflicting legal systems. So you all may not encounter libertines as often as a scholar of the 18th century might, right? But this category of quasi-crime is not unique to early modern France. A libertine methodology, as I have deployed it, twines together strands of critical theory informed by feminism, by queer studies, by Black and Indigenous studies, because these intellectual approaches really shaped my understanding of law and who is the subject of law and who is excluded from the legal system. The method attends conscientiously to these questions. What are the shifting limits of the law? Who can occupy a legal gray zone with few repercussions? And what are the consequences of disobedience? Right? As I see it, a libertine methodology really provides a foundation in between extremes on either side, right? Helping us to assess the objectives of states in relationship with individuals, of relationships between individuals, right? Within families, within communities. And it steers us clear of kind of extremist ideologies. These are really productive questions, I find, for historians of law, of course, but also for all of us interested in how childhood has changed over time, how families work, for example, and how these institutions intersect with state institutions. And if we play out the broader consequences of this method, I think a libertine methodology has implications for our work as teachers and citizens as well. So let me explain. I think where civil disobedience directly challenges a bad law to highlight hypocrisy, the libertine doesn't break the law, right? Just sidles up to the edge of it and sticks a toe over and then pulls it back and says, what's the problem? They use humor to challenge zealots and to mock unyielding authorities. They ask forgiveness, often with an eye roll. I am wrapping up. They ask forgiveness rather than permission, right? And they are in a position socially to know they can do that, right? That, I think, is a really important piece of this, of understanding the position of libertines. These tactics are crucial corollaries to civil disobedience and direct action, particularly for disenfranchised people, for people who are Jim Scott talks about the weapons of the weak, right? I think the kind of tactics of the libertine methodology tap into that. So what does this look like in practice, to adopt a libertine methodology to navigate today's narrow straits in ideology? For this, it's been really helpful for me to kind of think about what are the kind of straits that I'm navigating, right? That we're all navigating. And an example that comes to mind is our role in our institutions, within our field of mediation, right? That we have opportunities to hold space for encounter and dissent, to observe when one person's liberty comes at the expense of another, right? And to highlight those places where you're arguing that that person's right directly harms you, right? And I can see, but I don't see it rising to the level of harm necessarily, right? That would constitute locking that person up, for example, right? There is going to be conflict in civil society. We establish mechanisms to evaluate degrees of harm before we jump to punishment. And I would argue that we need these, especially in big institutions like universities, where they can operate a lot like an old regime legal system, where you just jump to that lettre de cachet and deal with it and move on, right? I think a libertine methodology in terms of research really encourages us to transgress, right? To transgress productively, find common cause with our fellow travelers in different disciplines, adopting different methodologies, different careers, and different media, right? If you have a sense of your place in an academic hierarchy, right, and you're taking the opportunity to seek out, support junior faculty, contingent faculty, create spaces to protect intellectual liberty and dissent, even when that dissent maybe hurts, right, or is uncomfortable, I think that's an important place to adopt a libertine method. And in activism, I think the libertine method is sustainable, right? It can consist of daily actions to support those people whose liberties are sacrificed for the comfort of social authorities. In my own community, the opportunities for this kind of action are legion. I have to wake up every day and decide which, right? Recent shifts in the legal landscape mean that accessing abortion, reproductive justice, questions of LGBTQI rights, Native nation sovereignty, reclassification of marijuana as a drug or not, homelessness, and student housing are sites that require libertine method to showcase the transgressions that are harmful and the transgressions that maybe do no direct, clear harm to a society, and maybe we should consider affording those particular liberties. So in tracing the peregrinations of the libertine category, I wanted to recover this term's capacity. My research documents how this quasi-criminal category facilitated legal pluralism, smoothed radical structural changes in old regime legal systems, as the royal state assumed jurisdiction from the church, and as the metropole strived to incorporate provincial and colonial privileges. The figure plumbs the half-hidden layering of rights and privileges reserved for some, but off-limit for others. And from the individual who claims religious liberty in a state that promises but routinely fails to protect that ideal, to the enslaved individual who celebrates a religious holiday despite his enslaver's orders. I would argue the libertines illuminate that space between the letter and the spirit of the laws. Thank you very much.
Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we have some mics that are going to come around because we're recording. So questions.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed this element of kind of sanctioning all of these libertines to the island of
Désirade.
Yeah. Thank you. And I was trying to think, how was it different? Oh. Hi, sorry. Okay, so I liked this element of sanctioning these libertines to the island of Désirade. And I was wondering, how is it different from, how did it differ from what was taking place, for example, sending the undesirables to New Orleans, et cetera, and to the less isolated places?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So the notion with Désirade was that this was going to be a go and come back, a va and vien, right? So the notion with Louisiana and with sending salt smugglers to Quebec about a decade prior is that they will go and they will stay, right? They will no longer be an issue here in France, right? Deportation was seen as, it wasn't, but it was seen as a kind of permanent solution for that individual. That's not the idea with Désirade, right? So I think that's the main thing. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for this. Going back to the image of the Greuze image.
Let's go back to that.
Yeah, let's go back to that. I think I can remember Diderot writing about this. And I wonder the extent to which, and this is just my own sort of peregrinations through the 18th century police archives and others, I wonder the extent to which libertinage also refers to a kind of immediate absence of loyalty or a demonstration of an absence of loyalty. And not so much whether that complicates the picture at all, because I don't think that undermines the argument at all, but I wonder if the, I don't know how to put this really, I wonder if this particular sentiment, which is connected to attachment and belonging, and its violation, are just not a slightly different trajectory than other versions of libertinage that I think might fit more clearly with this interstitial thinking that you're doing.
Right.
I'm not really articulating this very well because I don't really know how I want to put this, but it feels different.
Yeah, I think, So I think I have an answer. So I think what this shows us is the degree to which filial piety, right? And that sense of your obligation to your parents is really part of law, right? It's part of religious obligation, and that is, through that, it is part of law. And to not show that, right? To tell your father, like, you want me to stay, and I'm going to go, you're breaking that contract, right? And everybody sees this is happening, right, and has been happening, but I think that's the piece where it feels like a kind of social moral you ought to, rather than a quasi-crime, right? But I think that's coming from us rather than from them. Does that make sense? Because I think so much of really filial piety and family relations is really set in law, right? Yeah, but I completely agree, yeah, that there's each of these, there are different shadings of the term, which is what I tried to kind of capture in this little nugget, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So wait, which?
Speaking to both.
Both of them? Okay.
Two-handed.
A remark, first of all, on the Greuze.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things on that is that Diderot, I believe, changes his mind.
Yeah.
So he initially sees this as a wonderful painting, and then I think when Greuze first exhibits the initial sketch, and then comes to see it as revolted by Greuze's choice to portray a father cursing his son for becoming a soldier.
Exactly.
And I find that interesting in the use of libertine, in terms of the question of whose liberty,
right,
or at whose expense, because is this a question of the son, of cursing the son for disobeying his father and joining the military, or do you see this as the son acting patriotically and volunteering to fight for the patrie? And if so, is that something that the father should be supporting rather than cursing?
Yeah.
So I wanted to mention that, just in that. And then I also wanted to ask a little bit more about this sort of island prison of Desiree. How does that work with the image of the Caribbean also as corrupting and indolent and kind of the opposite of the sort of regenerative place?
Right. So it's great questions, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so on the Greuze and Diderot kind of shifting course, right? I think that shows us the degree to which the intellectuals in the 18th century are actively asking, how does an individual's rights connect with their family's obligations, or their obligations to their family, and their obligations to the state. And I'm leading historian of that in the Revolution, right? That comes, we all know, that comes, there are often paradoxes, there are these kind of conflicting obligations, and it's in those debates that we find what it means to be a subject, right? What it means to be a son, that we're kind of constantly making that. And so I see Diderot's kind of reversal, his reversing course, as being very much in communication with how filial piety and fatherhood are are being redefined, the obligations of one to the other. The second question on Désirade and the Libertine colonies. So Doris Garraway is, her book, The Libertine, the Libertine colony, really, that is my starting point for this project. I loved that book. I think it's a really important book in French literature, in French studies, in French history. And it's taking the insights of Garraway to kind of play out how does that kind of discussion of the Caribbean islands as inherently libertine, right, and corrupting. How does that play in this wider frame of the Atlantic? And how does that affect notions of the libertine in France? Right? And I think that I do that. I think that I document how that works. I could say just read the book, but so Désirade is not in 1763. The administrators do not have this notion of the Caribbean being this corrupting place, right? Their goal is still to have this be a place of rehabilitation, right? Partially because they see that Désirade is not in the colonial community, right? It is uninhabited. It serves as a leper colony kind of before and then after this island detention. And the process that Garraway is tracing is really over the course of that last half of the 18th century, right? That this intensifies from the 1770s and the 1780s. So I hope that answers your question. It's really important questions. Yeah, thank you.
Keanu?
Okay.
We have time for one or two more questions. And of course, you were on this side of the room. Speak in the boat.
Oh, in both of them?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm thinking about the durability of imperial logics and what you were talking about as the libertine method for historical research and for us as historians. When we think about like Guantanamo Bay or the carceral state or the prison industrial complex, I guess my question is, do you think historians should be more courageous in drawing perhaps what some might say are irresponsible analogies?
Yes. Yes. I do. I really, like, I think it's genuinely important to go out on a limb. I do. There are ways to do that and still do nuanced, rigorous, careful scholarship, right? But yes, I don't know what to say, you know. I saw with the hurricane destruction in the Caribbean, to see the French government and the US government arrive in those islands and promise aid, and aid is not forthcoming, right? Yes, I think it is incumbent upon French historians, upon historians of empire to say, I have seen this play before, and let's get the institutional system to make sure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated, just like not so egregiously. Does that make sense? Yeah. I think it's really important. I mean, it's, a libertine is not an engagé, right? A libertine, I think really does still kind of build that in-between place for their scholarship in observation. But mockery is a really effective tool and should be used more by scholars.
We'll take one final question. Make it good.
Okay. Amazing.
Bring it, Bauer.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Jennifer. Fabulous talk. And yes, 100%, I think courage is essential, and I think it's so important in being a scholar and a human being on this earth right now. So yeah, yes to that for sure, because, and I also really advocate, just as really quick, more public scholarship. I think that we have expertise and knowledge that we can put more at service to others, and I think, but it does take a lot of courage to try to synthesize your stuff to 800 words and try to get it out there to a wider audience. So yeah, for sure. And my question also is just absolutely fascinating, but with these families sending their sons to Désirade, is it, you know, it's kind of striking in the sense that you're sending your child away forever, in theory, because because they're so bad, right? And it seems so unusual, I think, to our modern sensibilities that you would do that to your child. But I think also we don't always take into account the idea back then that a parental love had to be earned. And we see this in the research of people like Jonathan DeWald, who studies aristocrats, right? This is not something that's a given in the 18th century or the 17th century. So, and I'm just wondering really quick, what were the mechanisms for that? Was it like lettre de cachet? Would you ask the police to take your son away? Or how would this be done?
Yeah, it's the same system, yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's the same system. The lettre de cachet system is, and you can kind of say, like, I would like them sent to Désirade, or I would like them sent to the Ile de Ré, or I would like them sent to this monastery. I would caution all of us against assuming that we don't have these mechanisms. Right, so there are many mechanisms by which families who feel they can't deal with their children can send them away, right, distance themselves from that child, that person, and their behavior. And many of those mechanisms are deeply arbitrary, and there is no contesting the charge, right? And this is a problem that with the kind of radical redesign of family in the Napoleonic Code, people very quickly say, like, we gotta figure out a way that we can kind of arbitrarily detain teenagers again, because that's just too important to give up. I mean, it is, right? Like, teenagers are crazy people, and I have one. I'm not arguing with that, but you know, I think we are not so far from that place. Yeah, if it seems unimaginable to you, then like look around for where that might actually already be happening. Yeah. Exactly. Paris Hilton's memoir. I did not wake up today thinking I would say that into a microphone. But Paris Hilton's memoir, Lindsay Lohan, I think, has been a really instructive case over the past year. The means by which an individual, particularly an individual with some access to wealth and productive capacity for the larger family, can be detained without their consent. That still exists. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One more, and it's going to be very brief because we have one more piece of business. We want to recognize some of our award winners for this year. Tip and Tabitha are handing out some sheets to recognize the winners of the Society for French Historical Studies. And indeed, since we're a bit short on time, I will basically turn things over to them. Since the Western Society recognized our award winners in November in Victoria, British Columbia, and we had several recognitions of the inaugural winners of our Mission Prize. I'll just direct you as well to look forward to prize calls from the Western, from both Victoria and this conference for our paper prizes. Tip, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Jennifer, for a provocative, wonderful, fun paper. And I love the fact some people out there study Libertine, some people are libertines. But I'm not going to make any judgment about you in that view. So it gives me such pleasure to announce the prize winners of this year's Society for French Historical Studies Awards, the different prizes and awards. And I'm joined here by Christina Roney, the Society for French Historical Studies Finance Officer. So what I'm going to do is that about half of the prize winners are here, and we're very happy and pleased that they're here. So you have the names of the winners. I will read them for all of them, but then for the people who are here, I'm going to read the citation that the prize committees wrote, joined by one of my colleagues and friends. but I'll be only reading the citations, or we will only be reading the citations for the people who are here. Don't worry for everybody else. We will be publishing them on H France for the Society's Facebook page, Twitter, etc., as we do every year. And we will also be thanking the various members of the prize committees at that time. So I would first like to start with the David Pinkney Prize, book prize, and I'm going to ask Leon Navardi, Professor Leon Navardi, who was chair of that committee, to come up right now.
Which one do I use? I think both.
Hi. It's my great pleasure to announce the winner of this year's Pinkney Prize, and also to recognize two of the committee members who are here, at least they're here at the conference, Carrie Campbell and Margaret Cook Anderson, for their hard work. The Pinkney Prize demands a lot of reading. It's very exciting, but it's very time-consuming. So I want to recognize everyone who worked on this. So our prize goes to Meredith Martin and Gillian Weiss for The Sun King at Sea, Maritime Art and Galley Slavery in Louis XIV France, published by the Getty Research Institute. Meredith Martin and Gillian Weiss's The Sun King at Sea is a remarkable collaboration between a social historian and an art historian. It touches on the important themes of galley slavery and Louis XIV's ambitions of ruling the Mediterranean. Turkish slaves were purchased by the state or procured as captives. Although there were offers to buy back the slaves, the French refused to hand over able-bodied ones until the disintegration of the system. As background, we penetrate Marseille's commerce and France's conflicted relations with the Ottoman Empire, and we relive the experience of the galley workforce in all its brutality, and how they survived by setting up stalls where they sold the small products they could garner. Most important is the author's recovery of drawings and artistic depictions that have been neglected or misconstrued that show the presence of Turkish slaves within celebrations of Louis XIV's might. They literally restore them to view. This is accompanied by depictions of the appalling treatment of Protestants who were condemned to the galleys after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and which stimulated critiques abroad of the Sun King. The work stresses the importance of the galley fleet to Louis XIV and his ministers, although by the end of the 17th century, its usage begins to wane and representing the slaves becomes problematic. The presence of Turkish slaves is therefore an episode in French naval history that would be forsworn and forgotten. It has now been brilliantly restored. So congratulations.
Would Professors Martin and Weiss please come up to the podium?
Thank you. Thank you.
This is the good part.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We also have an honorable mention, and that's for Emily Marker for her book Black France, White Europe, Youth, Race and Belonging in the Post-War Era, published by Cornell. Black France, White Europe, Youth, Race and Belonging in the Post-War Era focuses on the question of how France sought to hold on to its empire after World War II and at the same time participate in European integration. In this social and cultural history, Emily Marker uses the category of youth to reveal that the two projects were ultimately incompatible due to choices made by key policymakers at key moments. Black Africans face too many barriers to have a sense of belonging in a Europe defined as civilization, to cast it as raceless, meaning white. Moreover, European policymakers considered Europe as Christian and secular, which marginalized black people, including Muslims. While French leaders attempted to create programs to promote solidarity between French and African youth, where Africans could be black and French, the legacies of colonial racism and European conceptions of whiteness were too much to overcome. Crucially, Marker includes African voices and perspectives to reveal the ways in which some Africans sought to use ideas of Frenchness for their own ends, while others believed that they would never be considered as Europeans. The book is based upon an impressive archival research that uses an array of documents from archives in France, Italy, Senegal, and Belgium. The study also engages deeply with the secondary literature, not simply citing work, but evaluating their arguments to discuss the ways in which its findings are new or build upon pre-existing work. Overall, the book reveals the deeply interconnected relationship between decolonization and European integration, making an original contribution in the study of French conceptions of whiteness and race. Thank you.
Dr. Marker, would you please come so we can congratulate you in person? You get our love and respect. Yay. Isn't it satisfying that such wonderful work is being done in our fields? So boogieing on down the road, we're going to go to the Gilbert Chinard Book Prize, and this year's winner is Manuel Covo, Entrepot of Revolution, Saint-Domingue, Commercial Sovereignty, and the French-American Alliance, published by Oxford University Press. This powerful, well-written, and convincingly argued study analyzes the triangulated transnational dialogue between France, the United States, and Haiti, contextualizing narratives about revolution in the context of quote-unquote commercial sovereignty. This economy history is powerfully argued between micro cases focused on Saint-Domingue, traders, and macro implications to show, in Covo's terms, the collision of forces, parameters, and circumstances that have produced historical consequences, and show the tensions between personal freedom embedded in the rhetoric of revolution and commercial sovereignty. The author weaves the economic history of the period with political and intellectual history to show that these trans-imperial actors created links that alternately strengthened and contradicted the projects defined in the metropole. These informal links on the fringes of empire caused friction, distorted colonial dreams, and reinvented metropolitan rules. Methodologically, focusing on the role of Haiti reassesses the centrality of Britain and instead shows how Haiti and the Haitian Revolution shaped Franco-American relations and France itself well into the 19th century. It's well-researched, and Covo manages to impressively reconstruct stories of Saint-Domingue merchants and their networks by means of multi-archival research using French and American sources. Thank you very much. And would Professor Covo come up here? Congratulations. What a wonderful, well-deserved prize. Honorable mention For the Chinard Book Prize goes this year to Joan Dejean, Mutinous Women, How French Convicts Became Founding Mothers of the Gulf Coast, published by Basic Books. And again, you'll be seeing that citation published in the very near future. So yay Joan Dejean. The Corin Prize is awarded this year to Judith Circus, Custody Battles and the Politics of Franco-Algerian Divorce, 1962 to 1992, published by the Journal of Modern History. And Professor Circus is unable to join us, but we should give a Congratulations, Jennifer. That's so wonderful.
Jennifer.
Tabitha was on the committee, so that's a special. So there are two FAR Memorial Awards awarded. I think that both of these people actually are in France or on the way to France. So the first one goes to Marie Robin, a PhD candidate at Columbia University, for managing sex overseas in the French Army, Bordel Militaire de Campagne, sexual violence and decolonization in Algeria and Vietnam, circa 1940 to the 1960s. Sounds like a wonderful project. And Alec Zhiskovich, who is at Columbia University as well. Ambient Empire, Ecologies, Colonies, and Nature Vivante in Modern Paris, 1860 to 1940. Congratulations to both of them, and congratulations to Columbia University for having two. That's wonderful.